All right, good morning, everybody. So once again today we are taking up the next gate in the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. And quick review, this shows up in the 11th fascicle of the 12th fascicle version of Dogen's Shobo Genzo. So it's mostly a long quote from another text called The Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So Dogen did not write this list, but he apparently thought it was important. And he included it and wrote some things at the end, sort of encouraging us to investigate all of these gates. So we have moved into a section in this text on the Eightfold Path as factors of awakening. So now today we're taking up the third one of these 8. So our gate statement for today says, right speech is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it concepts, voice, and words are all known as sound. So speech is one of the actions that comes out of view and thinking. So for the last 2 gates, first we looked at view and right view. We looked at thinking or intention. So speech is one of the actions that starts with view, moves to thinking, then we have speech. So first we perceive something, then we have some intention about it. We think about it, we decide what we want to do about it, and then we say or do something. So we do something with the mouth or something with the body. So this isn't our first go around with right speech. Way back at gate 6, we talked about right speech. We saw that it was about paying attention to actions of the mouth, and how when we pay attention to the actions of the mouth, we head off something called the 4 evils. And the specific 4 vary a bit depending on what source you're looking at. But it's things like lying and spreading rumors, engaging in slander, participating in kind of idle talk, idle chitty-chatty stuff, speaking in some way that causes trouble for ourselves and for others, friends, family, sangha. So this is the traditional definition of right speech. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it today because we've covered it. And we kind of talked about that before. I think the more interesting wrinkle in this Dharma gate is this concepts, voice, and words are all known as sound. I think that's kind of the new layer. That's the interesting piece to talk about for today. So the word translated here as sound can also be echo or reverberation. And that takes us in a whole interesting direction. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. We're kind of going to go down a couple rabbit holes and come back out. So there's an important text called the Treatise on the Great Prajnaparamita. And it says it was written by Nagarjuna, but we don't really know. It's not really clear who the author of this text is. But one of the things it talks about is 10 illusions that can be metaphors for emptiness. And these illusions include things like magic tricks and dreams, reflections, even the circle that you see in the air if you attach a light to the end of a string and you whirl it around. I mean, it's got all these kind of interesting illusions. So we think there's a circle, but it's not. It's just this light spinning around. Okay, so bodhisattvas can see through these illusions to emptiness. So they see an illusion as an illusion, and they see the emptiness there. So these 10 illusions, I mean, there are, it's using a list of 10, but there's myriad illusions. So the bodhisattva sees these things for what they are, doesn't mistake them for the one true way. So bodhisattvas understand the dharmas or forms are like echoes or like reflections, in that they seem to be a certain kind of real sound phenomenon. We hear these things, we think they're real sound phenomena, but bodhisattvas know what we might think about that, what we might perceive about that isn't the whole story. There's something else happening there too. So when you hear an echo, it sounds like there's somebody on the other side of the valley talking or yodeling or singing or something. It's not really what's happening. It's a reflection of sound. So Bodhisattva sees that for what it is. So the treatise on the Great Prajnaparamita says, whether in a narrow valley in the deep mountains or in a deep sheer ravine or in an empty large building, whether the sound of a voice or the sound of striking, there is sound from sound named echo. Ignorant people claim that the sound is from the voice of a person. The wise think in their minds this sound is not made by a person, but merely by way of the contact of sound. There is therefore a further sound named echo. The thing named echo is empty, able to deceive the ear faculty. So an echo is something like the face in the mirror or the moon reflected in the water. There is a face, there is a moon. Those are real things, right? Those are real objects that we can encounter. There's also the reflection. And the reflection, of course, is real too, right? There's nothing outside of the Buddha way. There's nothing outside of this one true reality. So the reflection is real, but we don't see it for what it is, and we take it to be the thing that's reflected. So we look at the reflection and say, that's the moon, or that's the face, or whatever is being reflected. So later on, this text shows how we get caught up in illusions and create suffering for ourselves and other beings. And it uses the example of people who are searching for a city. So there's apparently a group of people, they're running around, they're searching for this city. They see a mirage in the distance, think that's the city, go rushing towards this city. They're hot, they're tired. I don't know if this is a desert environment, but apparently they're expending a lot of energy. They think the heat rising off the ground looks like water. They go rushing toward that. There's another mirage, right? And then the text says, exhausted and troubled, they reach the middle of a narrow valley in the deep mountains and loudly shout and cry out. Hearing the responding echo, they claim that there are people living there. Searching for them, exhausted, they still see nothing at all. On contemplation, they realize for themselves and put an end to their thirsty wishes. Ignorant people are likewise. With respect to the empty aggregates, elements, and senses, they see a me-self and dharmas, their minds grasping with lust and aversion, crazily running around in the four directions, seeking pleasure to satisfy themselves, perverse and deceived, extremely frustrated and afflicted. If by way of wisdom one knows dharmas as being without self, without reality, at that time the perverted wishes will end. So that's the story in this text of these people running around looking for something, but it's all a mirage. They keep chasing after things that aren't real. So if we don't understand that our ideas are echoes or reflections of reality, we try to grab hold of these things, chase after these things, or run away from these things, right? These desires create suffering for us. This is the most basic teaching we have. We're going right back to the Four Noble Truths, right? So when we do see them for what they are, we can let go a little bit. It's not real, it's a mirage, it's a reflection, it's not what I think it is. Maybe the thirsting desire lets up a little bit, right? Because we're seeing clearly the way Buddha sees, or the way a bodhisattva sees. So here's one more example from a teacher using an echo as an illustration of how our perception of things isn't the same as the things themselves. So this is from Daoshin, or Doshin, a 4th century Zen master. Day and night, whether walking, standing still, sitting or lying down, if you continuously contemplate things in this way, you will know that your own body is like the moon in the water, a reflection in a mirror, heat waves on a hot day, or an echo in an empty valley. You cannot say it has being, because even if you try to catch it, you cannot see its substance. You also cannot say it has no being, because it is clearly in front of your eyes. So again, those reflections, nobody's denying the reality of the reflections, but we don't see them accurately, right? We don't see them for what they are. So both of these texts are relating echoes to our perception of the 5 skandhas. This thing right here. People hear echoes, they think they represent something solid that's generating a sound. There's somebody across the valley making noise. Likewise, we perceive self, and we think it's something other than these impermanent 5 aggregates. We perceive some echo of this and go, oh, that's reality. Oh, there's a self, it's real, it's solid, it persists through time. So the point of all of these things is that something comes in through our sense gates. We want to make something substantial out of it, right? We want to grab that, whatever it is, make something out of it, write a story about it, take that story to be solid reality, and forget that it's just a reflection of what we've encountered. It's an echo, if you will, of what we've encountered. Interestingly, most of the illusions in the tradition and things that get pointed to are things we see. So it's the face in the mirror, it's the moon in the water, it's the mirage that we see. Echo is one of the few that uses sound, right? So that's a sound reflection. So I think it's some reminder this can happen with all of our senses, right? So, okay, what does this have to do with our gate statement? Which again says, right speech is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it concepts, voice, and words are all known as sound, or echoes in this case. So words are reflections or symbols of whatever they describe, right? The word fire isn't going to burn anything. The word spaghetti isn't going to satisfy anybody's hunger, right? It's a word that's a reflection of something. So if we understand speech and words correctly, then we don't cling to the speech and the words, or maybe we cling a little less heavily, right, to the speech and the words. So we need the speech, the words, the language, the voice, right? We have to use these things to communicate. Just as we're moving through the world, doing our bodhisattva work, we certainly need language. We need to be able to talk to each other and write things down. But we understand that the words aren't the things themselves, just like a map, is only a picture of the terrain. It's not the terrain itself. It's a reflection of that. So concepts, voice, and words are empty of any kind of fixed, permanent self nature, just like all dharmas are fixed, empty of some fixed, permanent self nature. So the emptiness is there. Right, as we really seek to understand the nature of anything and the nature of thusness and emptiness, words are not separate from that. So they're a reflection. We can take them to be something they're not. We can make mistakes about them, but they're completely real, and they're also completely empty. So we get to hold both of those points of view. So in that very emptiness, we can see or hear, in this case, Buddha nature or awakening. Illusions have this real existence. We make mistakes about what that existence is. But echoes exist in reality just as they are. They have just as much thusness or emptiness or suchness, right, as anything else we encounter. They're just as empty. So we don't need to hate them. We don't need to get rid of them or somehow think that, we shouldn't be using language or words or it's something to be avoided. We also don't need to cling to them. So we don't need to have any judgment about that. Echoes exist, sound exists just as it is. After all, in the Sansui Kyo, Dogen says, colors of the mountain peak and echoes of the valley stream, all of them are as nothing other than Shakyamuni's voice and appearance, right? So the colors we see, the echoes we hear, the sounds we hear, Buddha is right there. Shakyamuni is right there. Buddha nature, emptiness, it's all right there. So let's see what Dogen has to say about right speech, because we know he makes comments about some of these gates elsewhere in the Shobogenzo. So he says, right speech, as a branch of the path, is the mute self not being mute. Mutes among ordinary people have never been able to express the truth. People in the mute state are not mutes. They do not aspire to be saints and do not add something spiritual onto themselves. Right speech is mastery of the state in which the mouth is hung on the wall. It is mastery of the state in which all mouths are hung on all walls. It is all mouths being hung on all walls. So he's referring to at least two different texts here. So let's start with the beginning of this comment, and then we can chase down the other references that he's making. So while we might think that someone who doesn't say anything isn't communicating or transmitting anything, Dogen says that's not the case. That's not what's actually going on. We're manifesting awakening or Buddha nature, whether we're talking or not, because we're already not separate from emptiness. We're already not separate from thusness. So we may not be using our mouths to make words and communicating in that way. Somehow, though, there is complete functioning. The universe is still functioning. Something is being transmitted and being received. So people in the mute state don't aspire to be saints and don't add something spiritual onto themselves. So they are simply 100% being what they are. And there's no need there to have some idea about whether that's good or bad or samsara or nirvana or make some judgment about that. People just 100% being what they are. Thusness is right there. So when we're seeing with the eyes of Buddha or seeing from the point of view of emptiness, we're not worrying about lying, rumors, slander, idle talk, divisive speech, all that stuff. We're not trying to prevent those things because the urge to commit them doesn't arise when we see the world clearly. When we see the three marks of existence and we see this one unified reality, we don't feel this compulsion to use unwholesome speech. So we can see that this stuff isn't helpful and in fact causes harm, and so that urge doesn't arise, or maybe arises a little bit, a little bit less, right? So there's no need to try to be a saint. There's no need to try to add something spiritual in, because that impulse to break precepts doesn't arise. So we don't have to call right speech a spiritual practice or anything special. It's simply how we function when we understand what's going on. When we see clearly with the eyes of Buddha, right speech is what happens naturally, just like all the precepts, right, describe how we live as bodhisattvas, how we live when we see clearly. So we don't have to think of ourselves as bodhisattvas or as virtuous people or saints or practitioners or something. We can let go of all of those ideas, and what arises in this moment is a natural response to whatever the conditions are. Skillful action, skillful speech arises naturally because we don't feel pulled to make a mistake based on self-clinging and some idea about what these five skandhas are. So whether we're speaking or listening or reading or not, we are not clinging to self as a reference point. So we're not making the decisions about what we do based on, I need to shore up my small self. I need somehow to protect my ego or, make myself into something. So the next part of Dogen's comment is, right speech is mastery of the state in which the mouth is hung on the wall. It is mastery of the state in which all mouths are hung on all walls. It is all mouths being hung on all walls. So this is connected with his poem 18 in a collection of 125 verses recorded at the end of the Eihei Kodoku. So Hojo-san has actually done some teaching about this poem. So fortunately, we have good source material to think about this poem and to practice with it. So the poem says, natural wondrous wisdom itself is true suchness. Why should we employ Confucian discourse or Buddhist texts? Rely on sitting at ease at your place and hang your mouth on the wall. Friends arrive here and are released from emptiness. So this is Dogen's poem. So natural wondrous wisdom itself is true suchness. So when we see reality beyond human thinking, beyond desire, beyond human delusion, story writing and all of that stuff, we see emptiness. We see that things don't have a fixed and permanent self nature that persists through time. So we don't create or acquire that kind of wisdom by study. We don't read books and suddenly become able to see this. It's just about seeing things as they are. So if we sit down, if we practice, we kind of let the dust settle, we see clearly the way Buddha sees, then we can see this reality beyond the hindrances that get in our way. So that natural wondrous wisdom is already there. So this is our original condition, experiencing things without hindrance, without delusion, without obstacles. Then our discriminative thinking kicks in. We start making judgments about what we like and don't like and write stories and all of that stuff. On that basis, we take some action and we create some karma. So we're off to the races. There we go, spiraling along, making all of these decisions and taking actions and creating karma and going around and around and around on the wheel. So we do this over and over and over, going around and around the wheel of samsara. If we can let go of the judging and the labeling and the stories, then we can return to clarity and see beyond distinctions to what this poem is calling true suchness. So we really see emptiness. We really see the nature of things. And we don't cling to the idea that there's some fixed state, some permanent state. So the original wisdom doesn't go away when it's covered by all of our hindrances and all of our delusions, just like the sun doesn't go away when the clouds are in front of it, right? Somehow it's still there, but it's not so easy to be in touch with it until we arouse Bodhi mind and until we start to practice. We do our zazen work and study and we get to some clarity. So the next line says, why should we employ Confucian discourse or Buddhist texts? So I think this is a kind of a reminder that language is a problem, right? This natural wondrous wisdom isn't something we can sort of understand intellectually with our human brains. It's not something we can get by reading or by listening to teachings or, employing language in some way. So anything expressed using words can't be a direct expression of reality. So of course, then it's easy to say, well, there shouldn't be any studying, there shouldn't be any books. There's all this, literature, all this Zen literature, and yet this seems to be saying none of it is useful. We should ignore it all. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a reason study is one of our 3 activities, right? Can we employ language? Can we read the teachings? Can we listen to the teachings and yet know that if we're clinging to words, we've missed the mark? So we again get a hold both of these perspectives. Rely on sitting at ease at your place and hang your mouth on the wall. So this line of the poem sends us off in another direction. Here's the next layer. Now we're headed to a line in a koan story in the Book of Serenity. So, Great Master Yuan Ming of Dishan said to the assembly, When you get to the ultimate end, you just find the Buddhas of all times have their mouths hung on the wall. So, to come back to thusness, or to come back to reality, we have to stop processing everything with words and concepts and close our mouths and just sit down, like we just did for 50 minutes, right? So we need to rely on Zazen, sitting at ease at our place. And Yuan Ming says, all those who fully manifest awakening do this. This is what Buddhas do. To simply sit down, rely on that sitting practice, hang the mouth on the wall, right? So we're not approaching everything, processing everything through words, concept, language. Can we see through the words, concept, language, even though it's useful, to what else there is? Can we see through that to emptiness? And the last line says, friends arrive here and are released from emptiness. So this emptiness isn't the good kind of emptiness. This isn't the thusness or the suchness. This is the hollow, empty discussion that uses words and ideas but doesn't actually express reality directly because it can't. And then we get caught up in it, right? Thinking that our expressions, our language actually is, the one true way. So in Zazen, we let go of discriminative thinking and we're released from this kind of empty processing, right? We're not having, I hope, having conversations with ourselves in our Zazen. We're letting go of all of that. And I don't know about you, but I'm highly verbal. And I laugh because I find myself in Zazen not only thinking in full sentences, editing my sentences. It's like, oh, wait a minute, no, it's not like that, it's like this. And then you think, no, let go of that because that's not helping. But we're just so used to processing right that way. So at least for me, sometimes I have to remind myself in Zazen to become nonverbal. I actually have to let go of that so deeply held impulse to express everything I'm perceiving. And perceiving includes thinking, right? Everything I'm perceiving in language and words and full sentences and right? Talk about monkey mind. So maybe you see in pictures or maybe you have some other means of processing, but I catch myself because, I spent years as a professional communicator. So I'm constantly writing and then editing my experience. Not necessary. I can really see how I'm literally writing the stories. So it's an interesting practice to say, well, at least while sitting in Zazen, not so helpful. So we let go of that kind of empty processing there. So if we're going to put this whole poem back together now, natural wondrous wisdom itself is true suchness. Why should we employ Confucian discourse or Buddhist texts? Rely on sitting at ease at your place and hang your mouth on the wall. Friends arrive here and are released from emptiness. Okay, so there's the poem. So if we back up one more step now, we put Dogen's comment all back together. Right speech as a branch of the path is the mute self not being mute. Mutes among ordinary people have never been able to express the truth. People in the mute state are not mutes. They do not aspire to be saints and do not add something spiritual onto themselves. Right speech is mastery of the state in which the mouth is hung on the wall. It is mastery of the state in which all mouths are hung on all walls. It is all mouths being hung on all walls. So, right speech on the everyday level is speech that doesn't create suffering for ourselves or for others, right? Speech that avoids those evils. Right speech on the absolute level is letting go of concepts, voice, words altogether, as this Gate statement says. Both of these things are true, and both of these things are important. So this Gate is not saying never say another word, go into your cave and never talk to anybody. It's not saying that. It says we have to be clear about what language really is and use it in a skillful way. Because we recognize the words, the voice, the speech, the concepts as echoes that can't express reality directly. It's a skillful means, but there's something else going on there. So even though language is a problem, we have to use it. We have to try to express something. We couldn't function together. We couldn't study the Dharma together. We couldn't take care of each other if we weren't communicating somehow. So, this is talking about speech, but of course we're including sign language and pictographs and right, every kind of communication. So without some idea about me saying something special or me saying something grand or something, right, we can use language in a skillful way. So even if we don't say anything, we're not really mute. We can consider when we take the Zazen posture, what are we transmitting? I hope we're transmitting clearly Buddha nature or awakening or something. And I hope we're able to clearly receive in a pure way Buddha nature, right? We can receive what's being transmitted, right? So even if we don't say anything, we're not actually mute. We're not actually not communicating or transmitting something. The universe is continuing to function through us, even while we're sitting and not saying anything, not taking any action, not creating any kind of personal karma. Something is happening there. So maybe you can feel that when we even sit one period together. If you sit Sesshin and you're sitting day after day after day after day after day with people together in the Zendo, something very interesting happens. It's not magic. I'm not a magic world person. It's not magic. But there's something that happens when we're dropping body and mind, dropping our barriers. You know, we start to function together. If you're in a training temple with people for a while, it's very interesting. You do morning liturgy. The people become interchangeable. You know, we change roles all the time. It's not like this is my role and I fully carry it out. We change roles all the time, and yet there is something that happens where we start to move together. I don't even have to look at this person to know we're moving together. It's very, very interesting. There's something that gets communicated. It's not magic, but there's something about being in that space, being in that Zazen space or something. The interconnection feels quite strong, right? So there's something interesting that happens in Zazen when we sit together all the time. I think chanting is the same. If you chant with the same people all the time, there is there are many people coming together, and yet there's one thing happening. And it's not, you know, so what we're transmitting, yes, we're chanting a text, and there is good in that. But there is something about coming together and doing that activity and being in that same kind of space and chanting together. Something gets communicated. I don't know what that is, right? But it's very interesting. So if you have the opportunity to come for morning practice or to sit Sesshin, even for a day, try it out and see what your experience of that is. So I don't mean to wander away there, but it's quite interesting how we communicate with each other as practitioners, and we don't need to be talking. You know, Sesshin is completely silent. And in our particular form of Sesshin, we're more silent than most. We don't do Dokusan. We don't do Dharma talks. You know, we don't have a talkie-talkie work period. We sit 14 periods a day. We look at the wall. We don't talk for 3, 5, 7 days. It's very, very interesting. Of course, the flip side of that is then you go back into the world. And oh my gosh, it feels like you've walked into a wall, right? Especially if you have to fly to get here. Any of you who have flown to get here, go into an airport after you've been sitting for 3 days or 5 days silently. Oh my word, it's painful. I tell people when you get to the airport, just go sit in the chapel. You don't have to sit, right? But at least it's quiet. You're so open to communication. You're so open to what's being transmitted. It's like you've got no defense. You've got no barrier. So it's very interesting. We can communicate quite a bit without actually saying anything, and the universe continues to do what it does. So because of interconnectedness, we're always transmitting something. We're always receiving something. We're always putting something into the universe and receiving something back. So Dogen returns to this theme of going beyond words and seeing reality as it is many, many times in his writings. This is not a one-time thing. In one of his poems, he says, "The ocean waves crash like thunder below the cliff. I strain my ears and see the face of Kanjizai." So Hojo-san has also talked about this piece of writing. So Kanjizai is Avalokiteshvara. It's one of the names for Avalokiteshvara. So when Dogen hears the crashing waves, he strains his ears and sees the face of the Bodhisattva. So if we're really awake, all of this transmitting and receiving is not dependent only on eyes or only on ears. We're kind of transmitting and receiving with the whole body. So Avalokiteshvara is the one who hears the cries of the world, but I'm guessing he's not just hearing the cries of the world as sound. I'm guessing he gets it with his whole body in a way that doesn't depend on language or doesn't depend on words. So Kanjizai means seeing freely, and another name for Avalokiteshvara is Kanon, seeing the sound. So Kanon sees the reality of suffering even beyond our ability to communicate that in language, because we know, we can't even always articulate our suffering. It's not big suffering. It's simply that moment by moment by moment, I want things to be different than they are. So somehow Kanon picks up on that even beyond our ability to articulate what that means or what we think that means. So he sees what's actually happening and responds to what's actually happening, as opposed to only responding to or hearing our ideas or his own ideas about what's going on. So those ideas are part of reality, but again, they're not the whole story. So what if we as bodhisattvas could receive what was being transmitted by somebody who is suffering beyond that person's ability to articulate it? Simply to see the situation clearly in its entirety without hindrance, and to respond on that basis, rather than on the basis of, here's what I think is happening, here's what I would like to see happen as a result, and then doing whatever I'm doing, right? It's interesting. How would our response to the world be different as bodhisattvas? So Dogen wrote a fascicle of the Shobogenzo called Mujo Seppo, or about insentient beings preaching the Dharma. And that phrase was around before Dogen used it. It shows up in a poem by Dongshan from the 9th century, and Dogen talks about this poem in his fascicle. So Dongshan's poem says, how wondrous, the expounding of the Dharma by insentient beings is unthinkable. If I tried to hear it with the ears, it would never be possible to understand. Only when I hear the voice with my eyes am I able to know it. So insentient beings are transmitting the Dharma, just like the people in the mute state in Dogen's comment on this right speech gate. So if we listen for words coming from a rock or a chair or something, we're going to be waiting a long time. That insentient thing isn't going to speak to us in language like that. We're not going to be able to take in the Dharma that's being transmitted if we're looking for that communication happen in a particular way. If we see that rock or that chair with the eyes of Buddha, then we get what it's transmitting. We hear its Dharma. We hear what it's preaching. So words about the rock or about the chair are echoes of its real being. So if we encounter that thing directly without thoughts that use self as a reference point, what is my relationship with this rock or this chair or waterfall or whatever, then that transmission happens in a seamless way. If we get out of the way, again, it's not magic. If we get out of the way, that transmission and reception is happening in a seamless kind of a way. So one of the points that Dogen takes up in Mujo Seppo is, what exactly do we mean by insentient? Usually we would think, well, that means something that doesn't think or something that doesn't feel, or maybe something that's not alive, some kind of inanimate object. Dogen's not using it that way. He means something which might include a person that isn't caught up in emotion, idea, concepts, delusion, hindrance. So someone who sees clearly with the eyes of Buddha. Interesting, right? So whether or not we're caught up in our delusion, we're still preaching the Dharma because we're always manifesting thusness, because we exist, in this one unified reality. But when we're not caught up in our delusion and we're manifesting awakening, we're also able to hear the Dharma, whether it's conveyed by language or not. So when we hear teachers saying things like the sound of the valley stream, the echo of the valley stream is preaching the Dharma, or rocks and trees and fences and pebbles and all are preaching the Dharma. It's like, what does that mean? Well, we're not receiving that in language like words, right? But if we're completely clear, we can pick up on what's being transmitted. So yes, if we encounter that rock or tree or waterfall directly, we can see the Dharma in the way that it functions in form and emptiness. But if we go beyond sentience and insentience and beyond sound and silence, then the same thing can happen when we encounter people or arhats or Buddhas or cats and dogs, right? Beings we would consider to be sentient. So what's the difference? Sentience and insentience. We get to really kind of sit with that. So that's, Hojo-san's done a whole lot of teaching on Mujo Seppo. We don't have time to go through the whole thing. But it's interesting when we consider transmission by language and transmission by echoes. So in another fascicle called Do-toku, or being able to speak, Dogen says, when we are able to speak of the speakable, we do not speak of the unspeakable. Even if we recognize that we are able to speak of the speakable, unless we do not penetrate the fact that the unspeakable is what we are not able to speak, We have not yet attained the face of the Buddha ancestors or the marrow of the Buddha ancestors. That's pretty clear, right? Okay, so sometimes we use words and language and concepts, and we recognize that that can't contain all of reality. It can't possibly include all of reality, but we express what we can within those limits, and we make efforts to speak skillfully in ways that move people toward understanding cause and effect, understanding the nature of how things work, right? So at the same time, we know that unless we really get that there is something beyond language, we can't completely manifest Buddha nature, or we can't completely manifest awakening. There's something getting stuck. So we have to see one reality from two sides and express two sides in one action, right? The main theme of the Mahayana. We're going to see one reality from two sides and express two sides in one action. We might be expressing that in words and voice, and we might not be. So right speech is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it concepts, voice, and words are all known as sound, or for today, echoes. So words are symbols for other things. They're not the things themselves, and in that way, all words are false. And this is a teaching we hear sometimes. All words are lies. As soon as we open our mouths, we've said something not true. There are all kinds of koans kind of working with that. And the only way to make sure that you're telling the truth then is to hang your mouth on the wall and not to say anything. And of course, we can't live like that. So it's not possible for us as bodhisattvas in the world. So everything we say misses the mark. And also everything we say completely expresses the reality of emptiness. So somehow we function with both of these truths at the same time. So when we're thinking about speech and sound and echoes, we get to hold both of these things at the same time. So what would you all like to say about sound, echoes, language? We've covered lots of territory today, opened up lots of discussion points. Very funny. He's listening for the echo back there. So what would others like to say? Questions, comments, reflections, here or at home? And if you're at home, just speak up so that I'm not trying to figure out who you are. Who'd like to say something after saying how we can't say anything? Do your best to express yourself skillfully in this limited thing called language.
I remember taking a class with Professor Abe where he emphasized that sanyata, or emptiness, he prefers to translate it as emptying, because it's a process. And I was thinking of that because I was having a discussion with two other Buddhists. One was a Theravada Buddhist, one was a Tibetan Buddhist. So this is an interesting collection of Buddhists having a discussion about emptiness. And I was pointing out that the earliest interpretations of Buddhism in the West, from people like Schopenhauer, is that it's nihilism. That so Buddha talks about blowing out the candle, and Nirvana means blowing out. So where does it go? Let's go to the left. Let's go to the right. Let's go down. You remember that dialogue? Yeah. So what of that? The idea that many people think of Buddhism as a kind of nihilism because of this emphasis on emptiness.
Well, and I think that's something we all pass through when we start to practice. We hear something called emptiness and we think, well, it means nothing exists. And of course, that's not what emptiness is about. We're not the first ones to make that mistake, because when Buddhism arrives in China, emptiness gets conflated with nothingness. Taoist nothingness. It's not the same thing. It took a couple hundred years for people to figure out that wasn't the same thing, right? So when we're talking about emptiness, we're simply saying that things are empty of a fixed and permanent self-nature. So that doesn't mean things aren't real. That doesn't mean we don't carry out our responsibilities in the world, or that nothing that we do makes any difference because none of it exists anyway, right? So we have forms, right? Temporary collections of skandhas and things that come together that we work with and interact with, and these things are very real. And we also know that at the same time, this is empty of a fixed and permanent self-nature. So it doesn't mean nothing is here. We have to be careful about that distinction, right? So words, I think, are interesting when we think about words and emptiness, because words are not tangible. It's not something I can say, there's a word and that word always means the same thing, or, it has some kind of fixed, I don't know what. We can write words down, we can carve them in stone. They're still not permanent. They still don't have any fixed and permanent self-nature. So in this moment, we're transmitting something by use of language. But we know, even translating from one language to another, how meaning changes and how words change. We know over the course of time, a word that means something today meant something different 200 years ago or 300 years ago. So, words aren't fixed either. So words are interesting. There's a form. We can write words down. We can kind of describe them. They sound like something. They look like something. And yet, in the midst of that form, there's still no fixed permanent self-nature. So, it might be easier to think about solid objects in terms of form and emptiness. But what about words? Isn't that interesting? Because they're there. We can't maybe see them or something. They're not something we can physically hang on to. But boy, do we cling to them anyway. Why did she say that thing to me? Years later, we're going, why did she say that thing to me? And we're making it like concrete and writing stories about it. And it's like, okay, so we can't act in the past. We can't change what happened. And yet still the words are powerful. We want to cling to those things. And certainly when it comes to words like words of teachings, how many times did I just quote Hojo-san? We're passing these words down and we want to cling to them and say, my teacher says, therefore, this is always going to be true. But again, we have koan stories about that, right? People who imitate their teachers. And in every situation, they say what the teacher said. And at some point, that stops being appropriate because things have changed, right? So even that doesn't have any fixed, permanent self-nature. So I think this is an interesting gate in that we're trying to intersect these things now, not with rocks and stones, but with something as sort of ephemeral, if you will, as language. So we're not saying that doesn't exist. We're saying it doesn't have a fixed and permanent self-nature. Not the same thing. Do you want to say anything else about that?
Well, when you keep qualifying, fixed permanent self, right? And actually, I remember reading an article, I think it was Tricycle a few months ago, where the author points out that when the teachings say that there is no self within the five aggregates, it never says that there's no self, only that there's no self in the five aggregates.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so those five aggregates are changing all the time. So what part of that do you point to and say that's self? Right? There's nothing we can grab and say that's self. Right? So those aggregates are changing all the time, and yet five skandhas are clinging to five skandhas. So somehow in there's a concept being created called me, called self. So that self isn't what we think it is, but that doesn't mean that concept of self doesn't exist. What is outside of this one unified reality? What is outside of Buddha nature? There's nothing we can think of that is outside of Buddha nature. Therefore, those things exist, but they don't exist in the way we perceive them, right? So there is a self, but it's not what we think those five aggregates are. So it gets very complicated, right? So it's like if we let go of that, of clinging to that idea about self, and we can see five aggregates for what they are, now we see clearly and we take skillful action. It's when we're bound up in this idea that there's five skandhas and I'm going to cling to that and make a story out of that called self and take action based on that as a reference point. Everything I do is about sort of preserving this self, which is my invention. We can start to see how that unravels, right? So these things that Ritoku is bringing up are some really important, very core teachings for us, right? Things we come back to over and over. So intellectually, we understand five skandhas clinging to five skandhas, and then we go out the door and we get cut off in traffic, and what happens, right? So we can talk about it, we can think about it, we can intellectually understand it, and then, not to make a pun, when the rubber meets the road, and we go out there and get cut off in traffic, it's like, wow, I haven't let go of that yet. Somebody is still, doing something to me. So this is why this is a lifelong transformative practice and why we don't just sit down once and get it. What would others like to say? Questions, comments, reflections? Hoshin, please.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, without becoming some kind of a philosophical game of some
Yep,
sort.
yep.
When words actually become a direct expression of reality.
Is it possible?
Yes.
Okay, how?
Well,
I don't disagree with you, but
I know.
want to hear what you
I'm
say.
trying to think of a place to go with that because
Yeah.
I think that there are times when, well, of course they express reality directly as words, as the reality of the word. Okay,
Yep,
so there's the game.
yep.
Um, so what about it being, speaking about emptiness, what
Mm-hmm.
you were talking about, um, just saying something like emptiness is the, expresses the, boy,
And this is the
yeah,
problem,
I
folks,
know,
right here.
my head, but it's already become something else.
I know, this is the
Um,
problem. This is the problem, right?
um,
Anything we say about emptiness is a lie because it means there is something which is not emptiness. As soon as I say emptiness is da 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 da, it means there's something which emptiness is not, which is not possible.
well, just to oppose the idea of nihilism,
Mm-hmm.
just to say that emptiness becomes real emptiness in this case expresses the reality of the moment,
Mm-hmm.
or has the ability, has the potential of expressing the reality of the
Mm-hmm.
moment,
Well, yeah.
or being filled with the moment.
Yep.
There we are. So I know
We can put any kind of
it's
language on it, and
impossible.
we can't quite get there, which makes us crazy because how do we learn in this culture? It's all by reading and studying and intellectual stuff, right?
And
And
we overdo it.
now,
We kind of overdo it too.
well, and we need to do that. Buddha never said, Dogen never said, shut off your brain and don't use it. He said, they're saying, like, look carefully at that process and what's going on. And there are times where we have to let go of the intellect, the words, the concepts in order to really, really see what's going on. I'm sure it's happened to everybody here. You go along thinking you understand a situation and there's some small thing, some opening happens. You go, oh, wait a minute. This is not at all what I thought was happening, you know, and you let go of that story and immediately you can see things you didn't see before. Oh, there's this whole thing I never even saw, right? It happens to us.
Poetry.
Well, poetry is interesting because I think, there's a reason there's a lot of poetry attached to Zen because it's sort of a non-standard way of speaking that tries to express the inexpressible. So it's pointing us to stuff. It can't contain all of this this moment of one unified reality, but it's pointing stuff. I think in a way, photography is kind of the same. It's capturing like one moment. And as soon as you capture it, of course it's gone. But it's like, what can you express in this instant, in this moment, which has no beginning, has no end, eternal now and all of that. So I think people turn to poetry because they're trying to use language in a non-standard way to express what standard language can express, right? But again, I see you. But again, I think what is the poetry doing? It's conjuring up an impression for me when I read it, which is my idea of the poem, and the poem is the author's idea of something. It's very interesting. We kind of can become removed from the reality of this moment. So poetry is helpful, I think, in that it can break us out of habituate thinking. A really interesting expression can make us understand a different way to see things, and that way it can be really helpful, just like koan stories can be helpful in that way, but it's still language, right? You wanted to jump in, please.
Sure. Well, I like the photography example because not only is it capturing a moment, but you also have a lot of control of ISO or f-stop or all these different ways, filters with Instagram to basically add your own take on that piece of reality. But another part I wanted to say was when I encountered this idea of emptiness and not being able to grasp that full reality, I struggle a lot because one, I'm a software engineer. Two, I grew up in America, and there's sort of like this idea of progress and science and all this, and so I was really having trouble with it. It's like, well, obviously we're doing something right because we've made so many uh, strides in uh, material wealth, um, and I would also say intellectual wealth in terms of at least trying to grasp some of reality and categorizing it in some ways that are helpful, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But then I realized, oh, well, if we take the example of trying to codify species, um, uh, it can't be perfect, and there's always even in those very small categories, there's still that little spectrum that no matter how many Latin phonemes we put in there, right? There's no way we're going to get truly that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can't describe it all.
Right.
We can't describe it all. But I think there's something interesting when we have some experience of emptiness and we realize it's not only that I can let go of my need to grasp the whole world, but it's helpful. It's a big relief if I'm not running around trying to grab and hold and describe and right like intellectual. Like, whew, I don't have to do that. I can function. I can live without doing that. I don't need that level of grasping and control, right? I can just that And again, this doesn't mean we live our lives in an irresponsible way. We still have to pay our bills and take care of our homes and take care of our families. And it's not saying, just kind of abrogate your responsibility. But if I don't have to cling to all that stuff, if I don't have to cling to a self, oh, I will never forget the day where I realized, oh, I don't have to make my situation okay for me. It is what it is. I need to act responsibly in this circumstance. I don't have to be okay with it. I don't have to justify why I'm here in this circumstance doing this thing. It's like, here it is. I'm just going to, in this moment, take the most skillful action I can. Yep. Mark, please.
Yeah, so one thing I'm thinking, since this is all in relation to right speech, right? So we're thinking about how is it that we can actually conduct ourselves skillfully, and this way we're kind of using words that represent some version of reality very imprecisely. And I work in a field where, I'm in academia, so I am constantly confronted by jargon, right? And so you run into jargon regularly, and there's a lot of buzzwords that come from that, especially when things become tied to some sort of political idea or cultural idea or religious idea or something like that. Then those buzzwords start to really branch off. People love to use them, and they start taking on different connotations in different people's heads depending on which sort of persuasion that they might be coming from. And sometimes those words are helpful because once you hear that word, it's like, okay, I can see what the problem is with this type of thing. But then when you get attached to it, it's used in such a way that it represents something completely different to someone coming from a completely different background. And so I guess where I'm coming from this now is, how to be able to find these things skillfully, right? And so are there particular jargon or buzzwords or words that can be used to some sort of skillful attempt, but then understand the need to retire them after a small period of way, just as a means so that we can increase the effectiveness with which we communicate with people outside of our little level.
Sure. Well, when we have sort of popular language like that, it creates a shared culture. I'm part of the in-group because I know what the words mean. I mean, I have to say, there's stuff I read like online. I don't even know what the words mean anymore. I'm so not a part of that world anymore. It's like, I don't even, the word of the day doesn't mean anything to me. So we want to cling to that because this is part of my shared culture. This is part of my connection to a particular community or group or, whatever. But if those words don't mean the same thing to everybody, that's a problem. So there are some situations where we can start an interaction by saying, okay, let's be clear about what we mean by that. But of course, there's lots of situations where we can't. So we have to pay some attention. We have to be careful because, we might like to retire certain words and we might retire them from our own vocabularies, but we don't have any effect on the rest of the culture, right? So we really do have to be careful. I was looking at something the other day, which was pointing out the differences between British English and American English and how there are words you just don't use in one or the other. They mean something like pretty specific. And yet supposedly we speak the same language, right? So again, these words don't have any fixed permanent self-nature. There's so much that's situational. And yet we want to cling to them because they mean something. I mean, look just at names. I didn't grow up being called Hoko. So when something like your teacher gives you a Dharma name and you think, well, what is that word about? And then you sort of take that on and you shift your identity, and some of us Dharma teachers actually have made these things our legal names. So now even the government knows us by, a Dharma name. You just think, isn't it interesting what that word will take on? And of course, those Dharma names are given quite intentionally. It's either something that's some reflection of your practice, or it's something your teacher thinks you need to work on. So, there's an interesting shift coming just from that language within that very specific kind of thing. Let me not keep talking. What would you like to say?
So the photography thing maybe, it gave me words to describe something I was thinking. So photography, yes, you take a picture, it's a good reflection, a good echo of what's going on at the moment. Something else it does is frame and reorganize and whatever the situation, right?
Yep.
I think words do the same thing, right? There's both a descriptive part of it, but then there's also a constructive part of it.
Absolutely.
You pick stuff out, rearrange it. Now the thing, at least my perception, looks like, what I just described it as, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed that myself in counseling. I had learned all the different diagnoses, right? Talking to people, I'm like, oh, okay, you are the depressed person, or whatever, right? And that was something I really had to work on. Right?
Yeah.
It's not very helpful.
Well, in some situations, you have to do that. You can't not use that language with your colleagues, and you're helping somebody with that language. The problem is we take that word and say that is the sum total of that person. That's the person who's depressed. That's the person who talks too much. Right? And then that becomes, as you say, that frames a particular thing, but it's not the sum total of the reality of that person in that moment. So there are times we have to do that. We can't not do that. And yet, can we see through that and say there's something else happening? I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, you're right. Yeah, I mean, there's something inside. I can't remember the specific phrase. It's like when you're communicating, it's the silence says a lot about what you're doing too. And that was helpful for making those finalized steps of overcoming this diagnosing horrible people. Anyway, I guess my question is how do you folks see that half of the equation, right? The constructive part. Is that something that only exists in perception, or does that actually affect reality, or whatever? Maybe.
Well, I think so. As we've said, we have views. Things come in through the sense gates, and we think about them, and we construct something, and then we take some action based on that construct. And so in that way, we're affecting other people, right? What we think and do and say affects other people and affects what else is happening. So in that way, it becomes real. We realize, it becomes real. So I have some perception of you, and I behave toward you in a certain way, and I'm putting something out there in the universe, good, bad, or indifferent. So this is why things like right speech, right action, right thinking are important. It's why they're in the Eightfold Path. Is because, my goodness, we take action and we can really perpetuate some suffering. So we have to pay attention to that stuff. And at the same time, can we understand that's my construct? That's my personal story about whatever it is. Doesn't make it wrong, doesn't make it bad, doesn't make it not real. But do I see it for what it really is? Or do I think my perception of my story is the only way reality is, and this is the whole thing? Like I say, one little thing shifts and it's like, oh, wait a minute. I completely rewrite my story. I see something completely different happening here. Or sometimes we can do that for others, and that might be part of what you do with people. Can we redirect? Can we reorient? Do you see that you're focused on this, but there's also this, and how does that change your response, hopeful, wholesome or not, in this moment? Because we get fixated on this little window, right? Um, I'm thinking about a conversation I had with a practitioner when I was running the Milwaukee Zen Center, and she thought she saw an unhelpful dynamic, and she was trying to help me. She thought it was directed at me. And I had to say, thank you, but this is not at all what's really happening. Because I was very familiar, I knew what was going on, and it was fine. She was trying to help me, I'm really worried about you because I think this person is acting like this toward you, and I think it's not helpful. I said, thank you, but what you're seeing is not what's really going on. I had to completely shift her story, right? So this is what we do in our practice, right? We sit down, we drop off body and mind, we drop off the need to be constructing. Oh, when we do that, okay, what is this moment really like? What is this really like? Or can I just at least temporarily put the stories over here? How can what's really happening? And to recognize that I don't need to hold up a yardstick to that. I don't have to be okay with it. I don't have to justify it. I don't have to come to a conclusion about it. I can just be in the middle of it. And when we do that, of course, then we really, I think, get some sense of non-separation, which, just like we were saying earlier, it doesn't go away. That non-separation doesn't go away, but we want to clutter it up with stuff. We want to cut it up and divide it up and write stories. Oh, wait a minute. There's actually, underneath it all, there is no separation. There is thusness. There is suchness. There is five skandhas not clinging to five skandhas. But we cover that up because we, and we need to do that because we need to take action in the world. As you say, we need to describe symptoms and categorize things and, put things in buckets. This is recyclable. This is not recyclable, right? And in the big world, we know that's a provisional thing, right? Mark, please.
One of the things that we do in our practice is improvement.
Improvement?
Improvement. I use that colloquially, but it's not really, trying to make things better for a better reason. It's the relationship in emptiness that we have is not a one-way street. We're not just grasping emptiness. Emptiness is grasping us.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're empty, we spend a lot of time with our teacher who happens to be anal retentive on recycling and have an index card a mile long on the refrigerator. You're naturally going to start to recycle.
Mm-hmm.
When you were adamant that you were never going to recycle after before. So you have we have this interaction with reality to where when we're interacting reality, we're trying to change reality as we act with it.
Mm-hmm.
But reality changes us
Mm-hmm.
because we are empty, because of the nature of emptiness and thusness.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're being just suchness and thusness 100%, where is that improvement without adding on something spiritual or something of the self?
Mm-hmm. Without having aspiration, how does change happen? Right?
Right.
Yeah. So within that emptiness, aspiration is there. So within what we're doing, we have some, we arouse bodhicitta, we decide to practice, we have some aspiration, we want to be skillful in the world and take beneficial action and all of that, and of course that's there. So we have some direction. And all of that's right in the midst of emptiness, because in the midst of all of that, no fixed self-nature. So we get, those things are completely interpenetrated, and that's not something we're going to get by intellect, right? Somehow these two things are both true. So the universe is doing what the universe does. We're contributing some action in that universe. There's some outcome of our karma unfolding. And in the midst of all of that, emptiness is there. So we keep backing up, keep backing up. Wider and wider and wider and wider perspective. I don't know if that's helpful or not. Hoshin, please.
Well, I just wanted to add on to that. I've just been sitting here thinking about this and giving the different ways that we communicate and maybe keeping it within the Eightfold Paths with that morality thing, speech and action, livelihood. And so is there, and I already kind of know the answer, I just want to hear you talk about it. So, is there action as language?
What do you think?
I do think. Uh, I think it becomes that, well, it's like that koan, I forget who it was, about the teacher asking the two students, is that, holding up a pitcher of water or setting it down and asking what it is. And one guy says, well, it's not a vase of flowers. And the other guy gets up and kicks it over, And so in that respect, it becomes the kind of the immediate way of engagement, I guess.
Sure. Well, and I think the reason that we have these stories about somebody asks a question and the response is an action is this trying to go beyond language. So are we communicating with action? Sure. If we weren't, dance wouldn't be possible, right?
Right.
Sign language wouldn't be possible, right? So, I mean, we know there's nonverbal communication. Dogs wagging their tails, well, it means something to us. We don't know what it means to the dog, right? I mean, there's all kinds of nonverbal communication. Singing without words is nonverbal communication. So is there action? Sure. As communication? Sure. And then we can spend a lot of time thinking about practicing with what is the connection between action and language. So if he kicks over the vase, there's some intentional action there. I'm thinking there's something intentionally being transmitted, but there's also something being transmitted when we're simply sitting zazen, or we're walking down the street, or we're talking to our kids, or whatever, right? Because we're never not manifesting Buddha nature. We're never not manifesting emptiness. Something is being transmitted all the time. Is it something which has direction and intention or not? Because that's how we know if we're creating karma or not. So I think you're not wrong. You want to follow anything?
Okay, it's all kinds of stuff's rolling around right now. So I mean,
yay! My work here is done. I've exploded people's minds. Well, not me, Dogen.
No, it's just I'm thinking silly things like, okay, so what's action to a blind person? And so it's
Well, of course, there's lots of ways we communicate.
Hoko Genesis has a question online.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead, Genesis.
Okay, so I was just thinking about something you said near the end about how all statements that we make are lies. And I was sort of thinking about a distinction that I have often made and a lot of people make, which is that there's a difference between being honest and telling the truth. But the very awareness that you can never tell the truth leads to a thing that once you become aware of that, you can never be honest. And the sort of realization that if I know that, I can never be honest, and is kind of been leading me down this rabbit hole of thinking about things like, for instance, I remember Thich Nhat Hanh was like suggesting at one point that you shouldn't express your views on things you're not certain about, but it's like, how can you ever be certain about something unless you are omniscient, which is unrealistic. I mean, like, obviously, if someone's asking a question, like earlier today, a friend asked me some question about like Ottoman rulers, and I'm just like, I have no idea. But that's very obvious. But and even a question like drawing the line between one thing and the other gets very problematic. Something that I've realized more over time. But I guess when you realize that stuff gets problematic, I just don't even know how to navigate something like this beyond. And I don't want to go some route of just being like, oh, well, I can never be honest, and I just have to accept that. I feel like I need to at least try to be honest, but I feel like if I try too hard at this point, I shall just never speak. And just wrapping my head around this is something that is sort of been bugging me, I guess.
Well, I think it's not a coincidence that one of Katagiri Roshi's books is called You Have to Say Something. Even though as soon as we open our mouths, we've missed the mark, somehow we still have to say something. So I think, again, we get to hold both of these truths, that on the one hand, we cannot fully express reality in words, And yet also, we have to use the words in order to take care of each other and help each other. So if your friend asks you something and you answer to the best of your ability, on the one hand, those words cannot fully express reality. On the other hand, they do express your intention, which is to help your friend, right? I think there can be some motivation, some intention element there. So given that we know that language is limited, given we know that as human beings we're limited in our capacity, somehow we still have to live, right? So I think, we can aspire to be as honest as we can be in our interactions, and part of that honesty is recognizing that we cannot fully express reality in words. I think it's not different than vow and repentance. We know our practice is never done. We know we never get to the end of our practice. There's no point at which we say, there, I've carried out all my vows, and yet we vow to do it. So we have repentance because we know our practice is incomplete. So in a way, we can approach language the same way. We know our language is incomplete. We know our language misses the mark, and yet we vow to be as skillful with it as we can be. So I think we shouldn't be uncompassionate to ourselves about our use of language as long as our intention is a bodhisattva intention, right? We need to use language in order to just get along in the world. So as Kaibi Roshi says, we have to say something, and yet we know whatever we say isn't going to be 100% accurate. Okay. So, we live in that moment. We live in that world. We know that. So part of the honesty, I think, is fully understanding that our language is limited. So in an interesting way, that's part of it. Accepting that is part of the honesty. I don't know, is there something there you want to follow up on, or is that enough for you?
I feel like there's also sort of question of like, what should you be expected to know type thing. So I was writing an essay a few months ago, and one of the main points that I was relying on for this essay, after I finished the essay but hadn't submitted it, I found out was wrong and that I was misinformed, and I had to rewrite like a third or 2/3 of the essay. And it was very frustrating because not just because of all that work, but also the idea of if I was a public speaker or something like that, I could have done something incredibly harmful if I had stated that as fact, but that was me being completely honest. And it's sort of this idea that I feel like there is sort of an expectation to know your stuff, but also what is reasonable is also just,
well, we do the best we can with what we have and what we know at the time. That's the phrase, right? You do the best you can with what you have and what you know at the time. So as somebody who's a public speaker on a regular basis and is supposed to be guiding people's spiritual practice, don't think that hasn't occurred to me. It's not uncommon that I'm halfway through a Dharma talk and I realize, oh, wait a minute, that's actually not what I ought to be saying about that. It ought to be something else, right? So when you're speaking publicly, we got a number of educators in the room. So educators and counselors know if you're saying something, those words can have some direct effect on somebody. So yes, you need to be as competent as you can be. And we also know we're limited human beings. So if we are responsibly doing our jobs and doing the best that we can, then we have to put that out there, make our best effort. Then we have to let go of it. And as bodhisattvas, we know if there's some unforeseen, unfortunate result of that, we may have to take responsibility. We may have to do what we can, to ameliorate the situation. But we can't be paralyzed, because if we're paralyzed, we can't be bodhisattvas. If we're frozen and afraid to do or say things, then we're not carrying out bodhisattva work in the world. So expectations on the part of ourselves or other people, I think we have to manage. And Dharma teachers fall into that category because people think Dharma teachers never get angry. Dharma teachers never make a mistake, right? It's like, no, Dharma teachers are human, just like everybody else. So is there some expectation? Yeah, probably. And we do our best to meet it, but we can't be paralyzed, because if we're paralyzed, we're not practicing. We're not living, we're not doing our bodhisattva work. So that's where we have to take our courage in our hands and offer the best we can offer, and accept that there may be consequences, and know that our practice is incomplete. Other questions, reflections from people? I don't have a clock in front of me, but it's probably ridiculously late at this point.
Nearly
11:30. Okay, so not so bad. This is a topic that people love to like chew on, which is good. Michael, please.
So in thinking about the idea of all words or all communication being lies, and also thinking about that in the context of Hoshin's earlier comment of like, is there a way to communicate that is like in complete harmony with the nature of reality? It got me thinking about math and how we calculate irrational numbers, thinking of like pi and its relationship to the circle. And how, and obviously the idea of all communication being lies is like a big statement and helpful to get us out of the thinking of like words are true. But I think maybe there's also some nuance there, like we see with the number that we define as pi. Obviously, you know, we learn in grade school 3.14. Well, 3.14 isn't pi, and that's about only as useful as calculating an area rug. You know, if we're going to the moon, we need a few more digits than that. But pi is infinite. We'll never completely calculate it. I mean, we've calculated it out to like billions of digits at this point, but there's still more. But I think the point that comes up there in my mind is there is an aspect of, you can calculate that out to a point where it gets close. Like there are points of 3.1415926 whatever is more pi than just 3.14. So I'm curious your thoughts on that in terms of just the binary of words or lies versus the truth of reality. What's the nuance in more of maybe a scalar way of looking at it?
So I think what you're asking is how is it important that we get as close to reality as possible or not?
Essentially, yeah.
Well, I think you've answered the question because it's situational, right? So in this moment, given these causes and conditions, if I am calculating a moonshot, golly, I better be close. And if I'm, as you say, calculating the area rug, maybe not quite so critical. I'm remembering in a nonprofit for which I used to work, whenever we were hiring somebody, it tended to be the same set of interview questions. And one of the questions was always, if you go through your checkbook and you find that you're off by 5 cents, what do you do? And the interesting thing about that was that answer, the correct answer changed depending on what the job was. So if we were hiring a bookkeeper, that person better be saying, I'm burning the midnight oil to find the missing nickel. If we're hiring a TV producer, it was, I spend a reasonable amount of time trying to find it and then I move on. Because to spend, for a TV producer to spend more time than that and to burn the midnight oil might not actually be helpful. 5 cents might be close enough. So I think part of the skill in bodhisattva action and beneficial action is to know at what point do we redirect our energy? Where's our time and our energy best spent? So I think you kind of answered your question, right? Depending on causes and conditions, we get as close as we can get and we know when to stop. So there's no one true way, right? I don't know if that helps you, but there we go. Jigen, you wanted to jump into?
Yeah, I feel compelled to share this because it's been a really helpful teaching for me. And it was from math. So because Michael brought up the math thing, I wanted to bring this up. If anybody's ever taken a statistics class, hopefully the professor has given you this very famous quote by Dr. George Box and he said, he's talking about mathematical models, but I think it's applicable to what we're talking about today. And he said, essentially all models are wrong, but some are helpful, right? Or some are useful. It's either helpful or useful, and so thinking of it in that way, not necessarily as lies, which has sort of a negative, almost like a malicious connotation. Thinking of things as being helpful or not, I think is maybe, at least it's been helpful to me. That's my understanding. So, but I wanted to share that because I love, and if you've ever seen a picture of Dr. Box, he's very sweet looking. He's like the person you'd maybe want to be your uncle or grandfather. So, so I wanted to share that.
Thank you. So I think it's interesting that we've gone straight to words or lies because I think what actually I said was words are false. So it's interesting that immediately we've anthropomorphized that somehow. I mean, so here's a great example of how we put a word on that and oh my gosh, it's got a charge. we are intentionally somehow being dishonest when we're using language. No, it's the language can't fully reflect reality. So saying in some way it's false doesn't mean, as Jigen says, it's not helpful, right? So we can't be too, I think, black and white about that, right? Situations, cause and effect, cause and conditions, I'm sorry. Other things this morning, have people had enough language, enough words? Anything else, other reflections anybody wants to add? All right. Okay, thanks for a very good discussion this morning. Let's do our closing chant and we will wrap up for today. Thank you so much.